Think forward. Think Research Channel.
From the National Science Foundation, where discoveries begin. This is Frontier. Discussions of today's most exciting research subjects by distinguished scientists and engineers working at the frontiers of knowledge.
I'd like to welcome you all to the celebration of the International Polar Year 2007-2008, hosted by the National Academy of Sciences and the National Science Foundation. We have a very exciting and hopefully very informative program for you this afternoon.
My pleasure to introduce our speaker who will talk about how the past informs the future, Professor Richard Alley. Richard?
So let me start you with a final version. We go to these ice sheets, or somebody goes to these ice sheets. Tim told you about how in the 70s they were big white mountains as far as the climate models are concerned. In the 00s, they're still big white mountains as far as the climate models are concerned. They still don't have interactive ice in them. But we like to go there and drill through them. And if you go to the ice sheet and drill through it, right here you have 400,000 years ago on your left, you have today on your right, and if you focus on that blue curve, that is the history of temperature in Antarctica. Now that is not the world's temperature, but if you looked anywhere on the planet and blurred your eyes, you would see something that looked like that. And what you would be seeing is that it was sort of warm and it got cold and then it got warm and it got cold and it got warm. And you know, if you look at that, you can sort of see that it's going tick, tick, tick. There's a clock here, and that clock is features of Earth's orbit. But we've had this real problem explaining that, because sometimes Antarctica got cold when it was getting more sunshine from the orbits, and that's a little puzzling. Why would it get cold when it got more sunshine? And so people have said, well, how do we explain this? And so they took the ice cores and they broke the bubbles in the ice cores, and they got the curve on top of it there in red. And that's the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what you'll notice is that there's a remarkable similarity between these two curves. And this is one of the iconic pictures of climate change, but it's one that's gotten misused in a certain way. And so I want to walk you through this very briefly. What do we know? CO2 and temperature changed essentially together over ice age cycles. Ice cores show this. Lots of different cores. That really is a reliable record. Okay? But if you look really carefully at that record, what will you see is that a little bit of the warming happened before the CO2 rose. The temperature never gets very far from the CO2. Most of the warming and the CO2 rise are together, but the temperature starts a little bit before. The CO2 lags. And so the question then is, what could this mean? Does it say anything about whether CO2 causes warming or not? And what I'd like to do is walk you through a modern analogy for understanding that, and then you'll see how these things are related. So the modern analogy is this. I go out with my credit card, and I spend too much. And if I do that, I go into debt. And my credit card company is not like some government organizations. In fact, if I go into debt, they're going to show up and ask me for a little more money. And you know something? That will put me deeper into debt. Now, there can be no question whatsoever that interest lags debt. I go into debt, and then the interest payments kick in. Interest lags debt. So how do I know that interest payments actually add to debt? Maybe they don't. They come afterwards. Could they add to it? So at any rate, what do we know is if we go and ask an economist, we go ask people that understand this and say, okay, if I spend something I don't have and somebody says you owe us more, does that increase my debt? And they say our physical understanding of the world, our economic understanding is yes, that does. Okay, so then we say, if I had an accountant, if I asked my accountant to get into it, the accountant would say, well, let us implement our understanding of economics to your particular case. Can I explain what you owe while ignoring your interest payments? And the answer is no, of course not. Can I explain what you owe while including your interest payments? And the answer is, of course, yes, this works. Accountants actually do work. And it really does, okay? So now let me take you to the climate of the past. And what do we know is features of Earth's orbit are moving the sunshine around north to south and summer to winter, and that those cause the ice ages to come, and then they cause the ice age to end. They cause warming. As the warming happens, basically everything on the planet changes. The ice starts to melt, the sea level starts to rise, the ocean currents change, the plants start coming back to various places, and in all of those changes, it drives a CO2 rise. And that CO2 rise contributes to much of the warming. Now, because the CO2 lags warming, how do we know that the CO2 adds to warming? Well, more than 100 years ago, the physicists nailed this. Well, hey, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. You can't avoid a warming influence of CO2. After World War II, the physicists got really serious. We have to understand radiative transfer. This is physics. This is fairly easy physics. You put those molecules in the way and they have a warming tendency. If we implement our knowledge of the physics of the Earth system into a climate model, the way an accountant would implement the knowledge of economics, of cash flows, and so on, what do we find? If you include the warming effects of the CO2, the climate models explain what happened. They work. If you omit the warming effects of the CO2, we have no idea what happened or why, because nothing explains it. You cannot explain what happened without including the warming effects of the CO2. And so, yeah, CO2 lags, but yes, our scientific confidence is high from this and many other things that CO2 rising really does bring warming. Now, it's not just on glacial, interglacial cycles. Now we're looking a little deeper. This 400 is now not 400,000. This is 400 million years. We're looking deep into time, up to today, over here, and these are various estimates of how much CO2 was in the air. Now, estimating CO2 before ice core bubbles is not a terribly easy thing. You'll see a fairly broad range. You'll also see changes. Above here, hanging down, is how far from the pole to the equator that ice sheets were getting. I have been in Antarctica. I have collected fern fossils on Mount Flora. It really were times that the ice was not near the poles because it was really warm because CO2 was high. And there really have been times when the ice came from the poles down towards the equator because CO2 was low. Now, on this time scale, our understanding is the warmer you make it, the more the CO2 tends to go out of the atmosphere and into other places. There's not a chance that we can find a way that the warmth is causing the CO2. It's the CO2 causing the warmth. The scientific confidence is high. When CO2 is high, the ice is gone. When CO2 is low, the ice is here. And as we come towards the present, the ice is here with the CO2 being relatively low. Now, the next slide, I'm going to take this little window of time right in here, and we will tell you the same story. This is basically an indication of temperature going from about 65 million years ago. The dinosaurs die about right here. And then here's basically an indication of temperature heading towards the present. We see the ice sheets popping in, first in Antarctica and then in the north. And this is our various estimates with all their uncertainties of CO2 in the atmosphere. And as we come to lower CO2, we get ice. CO2 brings warmth with very high confidence. History is telling this over and over and over again. When CO2 is high, the ice is not. When CO2 is low, the ice is high. Okay, now then we come back to this one, and this is that little tiny wiggle right over here in this plot. And we come back to this one, and then we crunch it down, and we ask, what are we going to do? And in a burn-it-all, business-as-usual future, I can't show it to you because we go out of the room. Okay? That raises questions. because history is telling us that the physics is right, that the climate models are right, that we understand what is going on, and that we are turning up the thermostat with very high confidence. Okay, now, so it warms, so what? Does it matter? Okay. Well, what we find is that those worlds of the past with different CO2, with different temperature, really were different worlds. In a high CO2 warm world, there was no sea ice in the Arctic. And we have sedimentary records that are showing this. There's no ice sheets. The tropics were really stinking hot. We now have pretty good data showing that. Ecosystems respond, and they respond fast. Even very short-lived blips in the climate, we see changes in ecosystems and ecosystem stability, and so on. And you may hear a little more about this later, so I won't do that. It changes rainfall, it changes droughts and floods and everything else. I want to go back to the land ice. We started drilling cores through those ice sheets, so let's take a look at the land ice and what David was showing you there just a minute ago. I hope you can't read this. We're not going to go over all of it. But there's an IPY project called ANDRIL that went down to Antarctica and went off the tip of Ross Island. It's a big international project. Their first results are just out in Nature here a couple of weeks ago. And what they showed, this vast amount of data, it's a glorious piece of work. And if you oversimplify it, if you boil it down to the essence, when it was warm, Antarctica's ice was retreated, and when it was cold, Antarctica's ice was advanced. You know, and if you then take a new model that was built, this one is not yet in the global models, but a new ice flow model, build as pretty good physics, and then you test that against the ANDRIL data, and you say, hey, this is getting a lot of things right. And when you then run this model over time and you kick it, what does the model say? What I just told you. If you turn up the thermostat, especially warming the ocean, as David said, it tends to push Antarctica back until you end up with situations where a lot of ice is in the ocean and the ocean is higher. Okay? Now, this is a very, very short piece of history from Greenland. We've switched poles here. 1960 is on your left. Today is over here on your right. And this zero over here is Greenland is neither contributing to sea level rise nor fall. It's in balance. And up is Greenland is contributing to sea level rise. And on top of this is a coastal temperature record. And what you'll see is that there's actually been some changes in temperature. It got a little bit cooler and then it got warmer. And what you'll see here is that Greenland was contributing a little to sea level rise, and then it sort of went to balance, and now it's contributing to sea level rise again. Greenland actually doesn't care who turns up the thermostat, whether it's us or whether it's nature. All Greenland cares is whether the thermostat was turned up. And we can see that if we look deeper in time. This is sort of the same plot, except these are now snapshots. This comes from the recent CCSP report that came out that I helped a little bit with. And what we see here is, let's take the mean 20th century as our baseline temperature and say at that time that Greenland has some size. We then ask, when it was a little warmer because of features of Earth's orbit a few thousand years ago, what did we find? Greenland was a degree or two warmer, and Greenland had shrunk a little bit, contributing sort of a half a meter to sea level rise. When it was colder during the last ice age, Greenland was a lot colder, and Greenland had grown, contributing to sea level fall. When during the previous interglacial it was still warmer, Greenland had shrunk, contributing a lot to sea level rise, and sometime back before that, when it was a little bit warmer yet, Greenland's ice had gone away. And you can't go past 7.3 meters because you're out of ice in Greenland. Greenland doesn't care who turns the thermostat. All it cares about is as it gets hotter, Greenland tends to melt and contribute to sea level rise. Okay. Now, we turn the thermostat. CO2 is a thermostat. It raises the temperature, and some say you're cranking it. Turning up CO2 is cranking it. It's trying to turn it up. When you see projections of the future, they almost always show that warming arriving smoothly and gradually. That we can fervently hope for, because when we know what's coming, we can plan for it. Harder to deal with if it's coming faster. It's harder to deal with if it's less expected. Okay, you see these projections and they're smooth. That is possible. Maybe it's even likely, but it's optimistic. Because what do we know? The last time that we cranked the temperature up, it didn't arrive smoothly and gradually. It did this. And that one in Greenland was about 10 Celsius, or about 18 Fahrenheit, or sort of Atlanta to Chicago or Madison in about a decade. And when this thing was going on, it sort of wasn't raining a whole lot where a couple billion people live now. We're hoping. It may even be likely, very likely, that it comes smoothly, but there's no guarantee. And anybody shows you a smooth curve, that's the most optimistic thing they can show you. Because sometimes it sort of staggers in. Okay? Last picture, and we'll try to get towards a close. This is completely different, and yet it's really relevant. This is 1750, the year on your left, so 250 years ago, and over here almost to today on your right. And this is the concentration of lead, plumbum, in Greenland snow. Now, we had an industrial revolution, and we cranked up lead. We started using it for all sorts of things. We actually had a Great Depression and a war in here that sort of kicked lead down. And then we had lots of people driving their cars with leaded gasoline. And at some point, we said, you know, we weren't thinking about Greenland. The snow in Greenland is not poisoning huge numbers of people right away. But this is a symptom of what was going on in our cities. And at some point, we said, you know, lead makes our kids stupid. And we really can't afford that. Maybe we should do something about it. And so what did we do? We cleaned it up. And we did. It's not done yet. It's not completely done, but you see it right there. We really did. Okay, so are we done? No. Okay, there's all kinds of great IPY projects going on. They're drilling in North Greenland at the Neem Core, an international IPY project that's going to find out what really was going on in Greenland the last time it was a lot warmer than today. We've been drilling in West Antarctica at the Waste Divide Core, going to really refine that CO2 and nail the lead lag and see how the abrupt climate change has got it. There's a whole lot of paleoclimate, a lot of history to be worked out here. But given all that we need to know, there's a whole lot that we do know already. You turn up CO2, it has a warming influence. And unless something else pushes harder in the other direction, CO2 warms. This is physics. It's really easy. When you change the climate, everything knows. Everything changes. Who lives where, what happens to the ecosystems, what happens to the groundwater, to a whole bunch of things changes really a lot in a big hurry. Okay? If I didn't show much of this, these climate models really are skillful. They really do simulate what happened. They really have made successful predictions that have been borne out over the last couple of decades. If they have a flaw, it's that maybe the world changes a little bit more and a little bit faster and a little bit bumpier than the models like. There's no evidence whatsoever that the models are scaring us by over-exaggerating, but there's a possibility that they're underestimating what happened a little bit. Okay? And the last piece from that lead plot, and maybe the most important one, we have proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that when we want to, we can clean it up. And so maybe we'll leave that as an optimistic view. And thank you all for being here, and I will pass it along.
Our next speaker is Diana Wall, who's a professor of biology and director of the School of Global Environmental Sustainability, a big mouthful, at Colorado State University. And she's actively involved in research on sustaining soils and has spent a lot of time in the dry valleys close to McMurdo, which is an LTER, long-term ecological research site, examining how global change impacts things like soil, biodiversity, ecosystem processes, and ecosystem services. And Diana's going to talk to us about Antarctic ecosystems and climate change.
Thanks very much. I think this is a good follow-up to what Richard was talking about, and it's how are ecosystems altered in Antarctica. And some of you may wonder what kind of ecosystems we have, because most of the time we are thinking about the ice and we're thinking about the coastal areas. But one of the things that we do see is not only do we have the ocean and the ocean-land interfaces, coastal land, we have inland high elevation areas. One picture that you see here is at 85 South. We also have living invertebrates in a lot of the ice, forming in criconite holes with algae. And so we have a number of ecosystems that we've now learned about. And then I want to spend some time just talking about the changes that we're seeing, because we're seeing nonlinearities and we're also seeing decadal changes, and the decadal changes are becoming more frequent. And I'm going to talk about two that I'm familiar with. The Palmer Station land and ocean interface, and then also about the dry valleys of Antarctica. And in particular, I want to be able to tell you what's happening with the food webs in these systems and what we can expect. And these changes are occurring, if you just think about a food web in the large food web in the ocean with the shark up at the top all the way down, we have links in the food webs, no matter where they are, all the way through the continent of Antarctica, in the ocean around Antarctica, and they are being altered. Let's look first at Palmer Station. Here you see the map of Antarctica, and you can see that we've got significant warming in the West Antarctic Peninsula. And you see Palmer Station there, and the changes that we're seeing per decade. And so, of course, the question is, what is happening? Well, we see that this is 5 times the global average. So this is really, really rapid that we're seeing these temperature changes here. But it's also the sea ice that's changing. We're seeing it arriving later, leaving earlier, and so the animals that live there are subject to this change. And what do we see happening? First of all, we're seeing a replacement of the penguins. You see in the red line up there a 78% decline in everybody's favorite penguin, the Adelie penguin. And you see moving into this area of the western, Antarctic Peninsula, you're seeing more of the other types of penguins moving in. And in fact, when you look further south, you see that the Adelie penguins have moved south, going towards even 4 kilometers down, farther south, and the number of pairs is growing. Well, there are a lot of reasons that we could talk about that. Is it just warming? Are the birds getting warm? And one of these ideas, and one of the newest data sets showing this, is some data that shows that this warming climate, with the sea ice moving out, we're seeing more cloudiness, we're seeing more overcast skies, we're seeing more snow, and surprise, the Adelie penguin doesn't like snow. It doesn't breed well in snow. It's a dry land bird, and land has now changed. Not only that, but the penguin is dependent on some food that is attached, some crustaceans, the krill, that is underneath that ice that is now moving further out. Here's some data that is recently out in Science magazine. Let me just take a second to explain this. Over here is where there are a lot of measurements being made over time, and this is the Antarctic Peninsula. And there are a lot of course, we know there are international stations up and down the Antarctic Peninsula that have contributed data to this study. But when you see that's where the ice edge, dotted lines, and how it's changed and become closer and closer to the land area. And then over here what we see is 2 different colors, and this is mapping the chlorophyll that's in the phytoplankton. And what's happening is you see here that there is less chlorophyll. This is satellite data. And down here, there is starting to be more chlorophyll. Now, what does this all have to do with the penguins? Well, there's a change in the phytoplankton where this algae, where we see this green chlorophyll. And we not only see a decrease in the biomass, we also are seeing an incredible increase in biomass and a change in the type of phytoplankton that are there. So it's kind of like if you were only going to McDonald's and then all of a sudden you get to eat everything you want to in the whole world. The change in composition has happened here, and the penguins are kind of particular about what they eat. So what is happening is a whole conglomeration of these physical processes that we've been hearing about with ice. This diagram shows it pretty clearly. There's 2 regions here along the peninsula, And in the northern range, we've seen the ice moving back. We're seeing more wind coming in. And these phytoplankton live in the surface. They've got to have the sun. But when that wind comes along and the ice edge is moved back, there's all this mixing, and the phytoplankton are going deeper. So they don't produce as many more phytoplankton, more food, and you see something like this. In the southern region that used to be, of the peninsula, that used to be covered with ice, the ice edge is also moving back, but it's much more now like it was up here. And this is now where the Adelie penguins have moved. So we have seen a shift in species composition along the peninsula very rapidly. We have seen other penguin species come in and replace it. We're seeing a change in the composition of the food. So this is not only affecting warming affecting the top predators, it's also kind of a bottom-up. The food source is being affected, and we don't know what the long-term effects of this are going to be. But we see that these physical and biological processes are now intermingling very clearly, and that climate change is affecting this food system. Let's talk about the continent itself. What about the terrestrial ecosystems? Well, we know very little of it. I'm going to tell you what we have learned during the IPY and before. These boxes you see, this kind of shaded area, they're little boxes of latitude and longitude. And the light gray areas that you see are where people have been, but they didn't record whether or not there were plant species. So, and by plants up here, I don't mean that we've got a tropical garden going. We're talking about mosses and lichens on rocks and non-vascular growing things. And so we see that we've got a lot of descriptions that occur here in the peninsula, and kind of around the coast we've got descriptions where biologists have been and described their favorite type of moss. And so that's kind of the state of the art of what we know. But what we know about where they are helps us to predict, just like it did for the peninsula, where things are, what we're going to see about the ecosystem response. So let me tell you kind of a snapshot of what we know. We know that plant diversity is low. There are 2 species, vascular plants, actual grasses in Antarctica, and we're seeing some invasive species. We know that moss diversity is low. There's about 115 species in Antarctica, and only about 5% of those are endemic. We know that lichen species diversity is relatively high. Kind of surprising, but true, that we have about 350, and you compare that to the tropics where we've got about 400 to 500 lichen species. So we actually have a considerable amount of diversity. But let's go to one of the most extreme places in Antarctica, the McMurdo Dry Valleys. And instead of seeing significant warming, we're seeing cooling. Yeah, it's true, it's cooling there. And so we're seeing these decadal declines in temperature. We're also seeing summer declines in temperature. And at 77 South, we've had long-term studies going, and so that we can look at these systems. Now let me explain the McMurdo Dry Valleys a little bit to you so you can see. I've given you some information on the temperature, and yeah, it's the coldest, windiest, driest. There's very little precipitation. The desert soils have the lowest soil carbon, so it's an analog to Mars in many cases. But what I want you to pay attention to is we've got a lot of habitat variation here. There are many ecosystems within even this extreme dry valley system. Soils, very patchy, lots of habitats for life, streams, melt streams that come from glaciers. Along the edge you can see there's water and sediments here. We have more algae, covered lakes, high elevation, low elevation, and we've learned a lot. But when Scott first came in here, you may have seen this quote before. I mean, essentially, people almost wanted to write it off. We've seen no living thing, not even a moss or a lichen. What a dead place. And this seal goes in there, and what happens? Of course, it dies, and then, you know, it's still around because it's a freezer there. But what about today? What do we know now that we didn't know even 20 years ago? We know that in the McMurdo Dry Valleys, there are over 450 species of algae, lichens, moss, invertebrates. When I started there in 1989, we knew that there were 3 species of nematodes. We now have found 10. So you got to look. What kind of things do we see in the food webs there? Well, they're not the charismatic you know, big fauna. I'm sorry we don't have any penguins there. They are cute, but I think my things there are cute also. So we have some very capable microfauna that are in a food web. And very much like the climate change that we see in the Antarctic Peninsula, we have also seen the dominant land predator, a tiny microscopic nematode that is abundant in the soils there and in fact has as much biomass as in the hot deserts in the Chihuahuan Desert here in the United States. That has declined considerably. This is with cooling, but over this period of time into present, we have also been seeing decadal events of warming. And it is expected to warm there in many years. The decadal warm floods. All of a sudden, we start seeing melt. We're seeing stream melts. We've done some manipulative experiments. You see a snow fence and some chambers that we put down, very much like they have in the Arctic. And what we see is also change with warming. When it is wet and warm in the dry valleys, when we have an annual warming event, an abrupt change, we see the soil moisture, the water, the habitat of these invertebrates changes dramatically. And as soon as we see that, we see the dominant predator again decline, the one that likes the dry soils, but the one that feeds on algae that are starting to increase shift also. So it's also this change, just like we're seeing in the peninsula. The top of the food chain is being affected. The food is being affected. And we also have tried to quantitatively model what's happening inland, and we're going to tie this together to what's happening with the glaciers and the soils and put this together in a systems. And just let me say that we're interested in soil because soil sequesters carbon. We're interested in CO2. One simple group of invertebrates, just one simple group of invertebrates, is responsible for about 7% of soil carbon turnover. So this has some meaning when we want to find out what does each species or what do groups of species, how much do they contribute to the soil carbon turnover, but also what happens when the algae, if it warms and there's more water, suck up more of that carbon and use it. What that can mean and what kind of predictions can we look at for that? Well, the decline at the top of the food web could result in significant changes because if we think about it, this is about a 65% population decline over 12 years, and that is an estimated at about a 30% reduction in carbon turnover. Now that will be balanced with increased primary productivity of the algae. But one of the things that we really need to find out is to be able to expand this across the land surface, particularly as they're changing. We don't have the distance and across latitudinal gradients yet, but I wanted to give you one example of a project that was an IPY project led by the Kiwis this past year, ecological complexity, looking at latitudinal gradients so we can better predict where these changes are going to occur and how they're occurring. This had about 30 scientists that flew in and did a blitzrig, geologists to biologists to atmospheric scientists, and this was a means of predicting by using both satellite data, this is infrared, to try to pick where are the warmest spots so we could predict where to sample, LIDAR, Landsat, all techniques, the morphology, the aspects of the valleys were put together, and then the teams went in and sampled a number of spots where we predicted life to be. So we hope to have some information that would stretch across and be able to predict as we even go further south and sea melting, but also what we will see continent-wide when we all get together and put the international data together. So let me just say that we're seeing differences in changes with climate, with region, cooling, warming, but we're seeing both places unexpected events. We also are seeing the response of the dominant animal is similar. We're seeing major effects and declines in the dominant animal and shift in ranges and shift in composition. We know that these can have effects on the life history strategies of the animals and also on the algae, and that we are predicting that these will have significant changes in terms of terrestrial soil carbon and marine carbon cycling. And so it's really important, and I want to emphasize this, that I think it's incredibly important now that we start to tie these physical processes, what we're seeing with the atmosphere, the wind, the sea ice, the land-ocean effects, together with what's happening with the ecosystem and the life there, because there are feedbacks that we may not be able to predict. And with that, I would like to thank many of my colleagues, both internationally and nationally.
Our next speaker is Professor Hajo Eicken from the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, who is a specialist in sea ice science, but he also is very interested in connecting up what's changing in sea ice, and you've heard a lot about changes in sea ice, with other changes. He leads a university-wide initiative at the University of Alaska to help what we call stakeholders, people in other parts of the ecosystem that depend on these changes with the science community. His talk today is titled Responses to Sea Ice in Transition. So please join me in welcoming Hajo Eicken.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I want to build on what Diana Wall already addressed, and that is the question of, well, you see large-scale changes, but often people are more interested in how they play out at a specific location on the ground, if you will. And I come from the state of Alaska, so we look towards the north, which means we can see Antarctica if we look in the rear-view mirror. That's basically the perspective I'm going to take today, is to look at changes in the Arctic, in particular the sea ice cover, but keep in mind Antarctica, because I think it has a number of important lessons that we can draw, including if we look at the paleoclimate record, which Richard Alley alluded to. And then I want to briefly talk about some of the responses that people, animals, and if you will, more complex parts of the system have taken to respond to these changes. And it's in that sense, the talk is also going to be sort of the response talk. I'll talk about 3 different types of responses, and hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll know which ones those are, and I won't have to tell you. Now, let's start off, first of all, with a quick look at what are we seeing both in the Arctic and the Antarctic in regards to the sea ice cover. Now, what I'm showing you here is sort of a combination of model output and observations for the 1980s through the 1990s. You're looking at the northern hemisphere's ice cover, wintertime ice extent, summertime ice extent. You'll notice that during that time period, in the summer, most of the Arctic basin really was filled with ice. So we think about the ice cover, at least back in those days, as very much a perennial ice cover in the Arctic. In the Antarctic, for long periods of time going back into geological history, we've seen this strong contrast between a very expansive ice cover in wintertime, more expansive than in the Arctic, and remnants of that ice cover in the summer. But if you look on the right here now, you see for the time period 1979 through 2008, the minimum ice extent for the Antarctic down here and the Arctic up here. And you'll notice that these two data sets are almost approaching one another. And so the question is, are we looking at the Antarctification of the Arctic, if you will, because in particular in these past 2 years, 2007, 2008, we've seen a very significant reduction in the extent of summer sea ice in the Arctic. What was fortunate, of course, was, and that's something that's kind of a theme throughout my talk, is that we're now in a position to very, very closely look at and beyond this type of simplistic curve, because we have elements of the Arctic Observing Network that are in place, and we have a much better chance now to really get a grasp of what exactly is happening here. And the picture is not as easy. If you recall, Diana Wall earlier mentioned that in some parts of the Antarctic, you actually have changes in ice seasons. So you always have to ask yourself, not how is this impacting on a hemispheric scale if you're interested in responses, but you have to ask about the specific location that you're in. So here's the 5-step program, if you will, in trying to understand what is happening in the Arctic. This is the year 2007, when we've seen a substantial reduction in the perennial ice relative to past record minima, almost a quarter less than what we've seen during the past record minimum set in 2005. And the question is, what's responsible for these types of changes? Well, first of all, we do know that there has been a long-term trend, if you will, of thinning of the Arctic sea ice cover. And we can relate that in part to the impacts of global warming and other large-scale atmospheric changes. At the same time, people have shown, in particular Koji Shimada and Canadian colleagues, that in the Pacific sector of the Arctic, we've seen a bit more heat put into the Arctic Ocean from the Pacific side, and the same has been observed, though at greater depth, over on the Atlantic side. I forget who was, Tim Killeen showed a picture of the NABOS program collaboration during the IPY. That's been instrumental in telling us just how much more heat is getting into the Arctic at depth. Now, if we think about the sea ice cover, the sea ice is very, very much like we are. The sea ice kind of depends very much on weather, on timescales of weeks to months. And in 2007, we've seen unusual weather circulation pushing the ice over towards the pole. And at the same time, we also find that because of larger extent of open water, something that's known as ice albedo feedback, meaning dark water absorbs more heat from the sun than the bright ice, seems to be strongly at work. And I'll show you a bit more on that later. And the net result of all of these processes is that we're also seeing a more nimble ice cover, if you will. And Stephanie Pfirman is going to be talking about that a bit. So what I want to show you now is what I found to be a very rewarding exercise that started about a year ago when at a meeting that included collaborators from a number of countries that are active in the Arctic, where we asked ourselves, or were asked to some extent, by general interest, well, we know what happened in 2007. Can we actually get a grip on what's happening in 2008? And the fortunate thing, of course, is that we had a plethora of sensors in the place. We have a lot of very sophisticated models that help us with this understanding. And so what was put together under the leadership of Jim Overland, who's with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was the Arctic Sea Ice Outlook. You can see the web page here. We'll have another one in 2009 that we're now planning for, that in total combined about 24 contributors from a range of nations, people who use models, people who rely on satellite data, people who have expertise at the local level. And we were asking ourselves, well, how is 2008 going to shape up? Well, here's the result. But the value of this year, which you could consider something of a forecast, was not so much in being able to fairly accurately nail down where 2008 is going to come with respect to sea ice extent, but it was more in the exercise of being able to follow the season of ice evolution over the summer in near real time. There's a big challenge to the scientific community now, in particular if you're working on these types of problems, that it's difficult to keep up. The publication cycle is on the order of a year or two. We often don't even have the time anymore to wait for publications to come out. There's a need to synthesize and integrate a lot of these observations as they come in, because we're also now in the position, as you'll see in a minute, that we can redirect some of these observations. And so models such as this one that told us very clearly the importance of ice thickness at the end of winter and where to put instruments based on that, and the role of summer weather were quite instrumental in helping us with our understanding. So I just want to show you a few slides that are highlights of this sea ice outlook. I would encourage you to visit the website. This here is one of two modeling groups that took ensemble simulations, essentially sort of making a good educated guess based on observational data of what the ice situation, ice extent were like on the 1st of June in 2008, and then running a coupled ice-ocean model with the atmospheric state and evolution of the years 1988 through 2007. So essentially what this gives you here for the year of the summer minimum, which came in at just over 4 million square kilometers in 2008, it tells you something about the uncertainty associated with estimating the summer ice extent that's due to the weather. So that was a very useful exercise. But it also showed us that about 3/4 of the variability in this here, or in the summer ice retreat, is in fact explained by the thickness distribution in March, the wind stress, what the wind field does over the course of the months of May and June, and the September air temperature. So that turned out to be a very useful exercise, and it ties in nicely with remote sensing data here. from Jim Mislonic and others that also tell us that at the same time, at the end of the 2007 melt season, we had a greatly reduced ice cover, but ice that was still quite old. And over the course of 2008, that ice has thinned more significantly and has basically been experiencing a replacement of old ice by very young first-year ice. One of the things that we don't understand very well, I think, is how this first-year ice responds to the evolution of the summer melt cycle. Now, what are some of the impacts of this? Well, you're looking here at a plot that shows the amount of solar radiation received at various points over the Arctic Ocean, and the trend, a linear trend, in increases in solar heating of open water, either within the ice pack in this type of form here, outside of the ice pack. This is work by Don Perovich and several other groups that we've worked on that shows that in particular in this area, you've seen more than a doubling in the amount of heat that the ice ocean system has received from the sun over the past 3 decades, which significantly exceeds the increase in heat that's coming in through the Pacific. So that's important to keep in mind. You could think of this almost as a thumbprint of the ice albedo feedback. Now, what's happening with this heat? Well, what was really fascinating last summer, and we can do this again this year, was that we have data coming in from these drifting buoys. We have people who are flying over the ice sheet. We have people out there in ships. We're communicating with them via satellite, having discussions about, well, what are you observing? You know, is what the satellites are seeing, for instance, here in the middle of August, is this the correct picture? But the buoys also tell us something that's very different from past years, and that is that the amount of bottom melt in the Arctic Ocean now is much larger than it has been over the past few decades. So we're basically removing the ice from below in addition to removing it from above during the summer melt, something that is very different from sort of the traditional picture that people have of the Arctic. And of course, this has impacts on ecosystems as well, because there's a lot of biomass in the ice that's actually growing in various points in the ice cover. Now, before we move on to response, let's just take a quick stop here and ask ourselves, okay, so what are we seeing? Well, on the left here, you have what I guess I would call sort of the, Bing Crosby's Arctic, or ye old Arctic ice pack. The ice pack that the whalers from the 1850s wrote about, and it tells us that, well, we have fairly little snow, the Arctic is a desert, we have lots of surface melt in summer. What you see here is a melting ice cover that's riddled with ponds, very important part of the way ice melts. The models are actually quite good at representing this for multi-year ice. We have very thick ice, and we know that summer albedo of the Arctic, at least during those days, was mostly controlled by meltwater pooling on the surface of the ice. And we had moderate ice velocities, something that Stephanie Furman is going to tell you a bit more about. Now, in the Antarctic, things are very different. We know that we have very high snow accumulation. A lot of the sea ice in the Antarctic is actually made up of snow that's turned into solid ice. We have very large bottom melt rates. In fact, the summer albedo, if you're in the Antarctic and you just look out, you don't know whether it's summer or winter because the snow cover really is very, very much the same. In the Antarctic, summer ice albedo is really just controlled by the presence of snow. And because we have so much high ocean to ice heat fluxes, we also have very thin ice, and we have very high ice velocities. Well, over the past 3 years, what we've seen is that clearly on these 3 items here in the Arctic, we're moving towards what the state of the Antarctic sea ice cover is like. But these 2 points are arguably as important or more important. That's the ones that we need to focus on more, because it's not really clear what snow accumulation in the Arctic is doing right now and is going to do over the next few decades. That's where, of course, the atmospheric models are going to help us. And this point here in particular, a very, very crucial point. I don't think we have a good understanding at all of how summer ice albedo is going to change. Why do we want to know that? Well, here's something that several of the previous speakers already alluded to. This here shows you the range of summer minimum ice extent that is forecast starting here now. If you look at this graph in around the year 2000, forecast by 2100 by different types of climate models for the Arctic. The red line here are the observations. And so you can see that, in fact, as some people have argued, the observations are already out of bounds here. my philosophy with climate models is I don't use those to plan my family vacation here in the year 2030. I take them as an understanding of how the climate system works. And one of the things that this is telling us that we need to take into consideration that the Arctic ice cover has already changed. It is in transformation, and the models may not really be capturing that because they're still working with a lot of the data that was collected during Bing Crosby's times. In fact, to put it bluntly, the ice albedo parametrization, a lot of those models probably is roughly the release date of White Christmas, and that's something that some people might be concerned about. But the key point is we can do this, in particular now, as we have better observations. So I want to just spend the last 5 minutes or so here talking about responses. Now, if you think about responses, it helps to organize your thinking. And one way, of course, to think is to say, well, I'm sitting here in Monaco or somewhere. What has sea ice done for me lately, right? Well, it's done a lot. And I think we need to point this out. If we think about sea ice in terms of the services it delivers to global mankind, not just the Arctic communities, we can do this the same way that you have seen this done for ecosystems, Millennium Ecosystem Services Assessment. We know that sea ice is a very important regulator of global climate. It's serving a very important function. And in fact, some of the plots I earlier showed you already demonstrate that it's letting up on that controlling function as the ice retreats. Of course, we also see sea ice used in particular as a platform, not just by different organisms living in the ice, but also by people, including people outside of the Arctic that use sea ice as a platform for industry. And so it's important and useful to think about sea ice as a regulator, and I want to show you one quick example here of sea ice as a regulator of coastal retreat, and then I want to talk a bit about sea ice use as a platform. So sea ice and coastal retreat. This is a plot that's been compiled by a number of projects that are part of the IPY, the Arctic Coastal Dynamics Project, where international investigators have compiled a map that gives you, in green here, stable or aggregating, growing coastlines in the Arctic, and also shows you which coastlines are actually retreating. And you can sort of see that this is a bit of a patchwork, in part because the coastline retreat is a very interesting case where the sea ice cover plays an important role because sea ice controls the thermal regime of the coastal area. It also controls what type of waves are actually impacting on the coast. But the sea ice can have an impact, as is indicated sort of as an indirect impact here, insofar as there's a link between ice cover and coastal permafrost, such that you can have slumping of these permafrost, ice-rich coasts away from the actual interface. So sea ice does have a longer range effect, and this is something important to keep in mind. Now, the other thing, of course, is if you think about all of these coastal communities here, and I'm showing you now results of a project called Sea Ice Knowledge and Use, one of the IPY projects that highlights the role of people in the Arctic, not just as people who are observing change, but who are also knowledgeable about the way the Arctic works. This was coordinated by Igor Krupnik, who's here in the audience, with collaborators from Canada, Greenland, a range of other countries. We've been working over here in Alaska, St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait, and Barrow, and we've tried to, first of all, come up with, well, what is the typical ice year? And if you look at this sort of as the year from January through December, it's interesting to ask yourself how different communities are using the ice cover as a platform at different times of year. So in green here is sort of the period of stable use. And we find that in the southernmost areas, there's already been interesting changes. I just want to highlight one thing, and that is ice use as a platform. What you see here is, some might say, a visual metaphor of the state of the Arctic. A piece of ice south of Bering Strait that's used by as a platform by walrus. The walrus dive off of the ice, feed on the seafloor, get back on, and use this kind of as a means of conveyance around the Arctic. Now, at the same time, you have people such as here, the Luther Komanosa crew from Wales and Bering Strait that also like to hunt walrus on the ice, use the ice as a platform for butchering. And so for coastal communities, it's very important to have access to sea ice. And the interesting thing is that access to sea ice is very different from just large-scale sea ice extent. What you see here is, on the right-hand side, a map of how sea ice extent panned out in the year 2007. And essentially, to summarize this, I can tell you that in 2007, in April and May, we had more ice than normal in the Bering Sea, whereas, of course, over the course of the summer, the ice retreated very, very far north of normal extent in the northern areas, meaning that ice retreat was much more rapid, even though ice extent really in this region in wintertime hadn't changed much. That impacts access. In Barrow, Joe Levitt is one of our collaborators who makes observations of the ice cover from his Inupiaq perspective, and we pair that with geophysical observations. His records clearly show, in conjunction with the satellite data here, that this rapid drop limited access to the ice for people in Barrow for a period of a few weeks. It increases the risk of people going out. It diminishes their chance to access the right type of ice. Now, at the same time, you look at a community like Gamble, which is located near the southernmost edge of the seasonal ice zone. In Gamble, what we've seen over the past few years is that people actually start to go out by boats much more often in the middle of winter, in part because ice concentrations here in the wintertime are lower. The whole seasonality of the ice cover has changed. So in Gamble, if you were to ask people like, say, George Apangaluk, he might say, well, in fact, you find that people have better access to ice-associated resources. So the question is, well, what does that all mean? And of course, here we could say, well, this is all nice and well, but things are more complicated. And as an indication of just how complicated things may be, I just want to show a map that's produced by Lawson Brigham as part of the Arctic Council's Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment. Now, you can see there's a lot of projected exploration activities for oil and gas. There's a lot of overlapping or contiguous uses of the sea ice environment. As a sea ice researcher who lives in one of these impacted states, I would actually look at this and argue that in some ways the fact that there are so many people using the ice is a good thing, because what it allows us to do is look at a system that is in rapid transition, arguably more so than anywhere else in the globe, but it has a lot of partnerships and a lot of institutions associated with it that can try various ways of how do you adapt to these changes. So something Tim Killeen alluded to earlier. So from an adaptation perspective, this type of patchwork can be a good thing if we turn it into something that includes all the best data that we can get from the scientific community and these observing systems, as well as the local knowledge, the local expertise that people have who've lived there for millennia, and try to see whether that's something that can help beyond the IPY, take knowledge from the Arctic and turn it into something that people can use at lower latitudes. Thank you.
Think forward. Think Research Channel.